all of you guys for really inspiring presentations. The 15 minutes, as we know, it's a very, very brief period. And a lot of us have gotten quite a lot of food for thought. I'm going to start off with a few questions, and my very journalistic background is going to come out and ask kind of the practical end of things. The two key words in this section are negotiation, but also new models. And Marina, I have a question directly actually for you about negotiation. I will repeat this question for the others, and we can kind of move into discussion. But how do you begin, in the case of South Magazine, how did you begin founding it? What negotiations did you have to make? And then in the second phase, when it went to Documenta, what happened then? And now in the third phase, what does negotiation mean? How did this become a model platform for you?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you mean literally negotiations?
Yeah. I'm too much of a journalist to go to this. You can go into theory if you like, but I'm first interested in the actuality.
I don't know, the word gives me a little bit the creeps because, in Greece, since 2008 or 2009, we've been under negotiations with the IMF, with this, with that. So actually, it's been also recorded by the Humboldt University Hospital. There is a kind of a new psychotic disease in Athens, and people specifically from Greece that they live in Berlin or other places, which is like the post-war trauma. And instead of hearing bombs, you hear the phone ringing, and you think that you owe everything, you owe your house, so it's a fact. So the negotiations, the moment I hear it. So there were not so many negotiations apart from passion to do this. One had to negotiate mainly with their own health and head, to stay alive, because, no money, no funding, nothing. And as I said in the talk, this kind of need to redefine and renegotiate what South is, because it was very obvious, and somehow liberate us from this identity constraint of global South or not global South, East and West. So that was the idea. It started, and I don't know, really from where, through a lot of free labor. All of us had to work in other places, but still put it together, and through advertising from friends. A little bit how a student, you will do a student magazine, in school that you take from parents and photocopies and things like that. But it went quite okay. It got quite a bit of readability. And the more known it would become, the more, let's say, of this kind of advertising we had, but not advertising as in a normal magazine, because people know. So no partners or no business model, no time for this. And every time negotiate, as you say, each issue. Then when Adam and myself, of course, start working together, then we start renegotiate the idea of how it would be. And we went through many stages of how, if the magazine should continue as it was, or if we should somehow find a way to put both knowledges. We had even meetings with more people from the core group, and we started working on a model that will be more, let's say, unifying between the ideas that we had before a South, of the curators and the editor-in-chief, that would be Adam and Quinn. But this didn't work so smoothly in the beginning, because, when you have 5 issues of something, and it was not exactly my mistake, and then the other people somebody else, like a newly appointed editor, wants to put their mind in it, to arrive in a kind of consensus is usually the wrong thing to do, I thought, and we thought. So we thought that let's do it that way. Let's host, because in the beginning of Documenta, Adam Simczyk was speaking a lot, and in his proposal quite a lot, about the guest and the host, this kind of dual position that Documenta would have in Greece as a guest and in Kassel as a host. So we thought to go farther than that. And South is a State of Mind magazine, which is basically such a small organization with no really any kind of sovereignty, let's say economical, hosts Documenta for 4 issues. There was no money involved, no exchange, nothing, and this went under the editorship of Adam Simczyk and Quinn Latimer, and that's how it went. The idea was that I was sort of informed about the subject matters always, because of course there is, I mean, we stayed along the same lines of ideology. The design changed quite drastically in the appearance of the magazine. And what we do now with the new issue after Documenta, and I have been discussing this actually recently with Adam in Greece, is that we thought, because I stress continuity quite a bit in my little 15 minutes, so our idea now that it's coming back and has also the part of Documenta in our history is to transition slowly, not to do a radical cut as it happened with Documenta, but somehow to transform slowly by keeping the same or the things that we thought they were convenient during the Documenta time, let's put it that way, and changing back or forward to something that we think it will make sense. So that's why we called it maintenance, because usually you're closed for maintenance, but we open for maintenance. So we make this transition apparent.
How did the magazine actually function as a platform for global Southern thinking? How was it different from a magazine perhaps from the North? I mean, I was thinking of things like Texas or Kunst. And we had this conversation on a Greek beach a couple of years ago. It felt like with the redesigner Documenta's involvement, that South Magazine went a little bit north. Would you agree with that, or is that just me?
In that sense, okay. Well, the magazine became for a short time rich, let's say that
Okay,
way. But for a very short time, I mean, the budget compared to €0 is unspeakable, you know, or it was a kind of a big budget for any art magazine, let's put it that way, art and culture magazine, and also the support you get from Documenta, you know, the offices and stuff, and, you know, so in that way, it survived for the next, like, 2 years, because always there is a constant struggle for every issue surviving. I mean, I don't know why, but every funder I ever spoke never understands this continuity. Always it's like, yeah, we can give one issue or another issue. They never understand that, no, we have to be helped for 4 issues or 5 or 3. There is a continuity in there. No, it's very hard. And then went north. What do you mean? That was the only... I don't think that the subject, the content changed. I don't think that the content went north. I would say more that Kassel went south in a good way, because for me, south is not, it didn't go south as per English. It went south. The sun shined, you know, on top of Kassel again.
I want to ask some of the rest of you guys about your first steps. Charles, Renzo, for those in the audience who may not be so familiar with these projects, also Alexander. Again, these first steps in making these non-Western projects a reality. Your presentation was super interesting, Renzo, but my question was how were you received in Congo? What is the interaction that was a bit missing? How was the white cube perceived by the people that were living amongst it? What negotiations in both the most basic literal sense and the theoretical sense did you have to make?
Well, the talk was only 15 minutes, so I couldn't get into, yeah. But it's been a long process, indeed. I think it started in a way with me between 2004 and 2008, hanging out in Congo, and most notably on these plantations, while making a film that I called Episode 3, Enjoy Poverty, a film that very much dealt with the irrelevance of me, white male artist, making a film about impoverished people and exploitative economies in Congo, and how it relates to critical art. So the film, for which I was in Congo for years, made a point that my presence and the film itself was futile. However, the film was shown in many museums, and biennials and things. And it was, to some people, a great film because it showed its futility. Nevertheless, it was really not admissible for me that all the benefits of that film, that again dealt with impoverished people on plantations in Congo, would accrue only in these museums and biennials, mostly in the West, not exclusively, but mostly in the West. So that's how I started, and that was solely my idea, this reverse gentrification program. I thought I have to make sure that critical art that deals with economic inequality actually means something to the people at the poor side of that inequality gap, the impoverished side of that inequality gap. So the idea to build this white cube there was entirely mine. I didn't ask people on the plantation whether they wanted to have an OMA building. I said, I think it should be an OMA building because this is what will attract the visibility in the capital and legitimize the positions that you, both now but also historically, have developed. So in that way, it was a very vertical project, contrary to the project that Alexander described in the neighboring country of Cameroon. It was entirely vertical. Vertical meaning top-down. Me, white, male artist, thought, this white cube needs to come here. However, it only became interesting, the project, when people started to run with it, and when it indeed became a tomb for the stolen sculptures, and when indeed some money started to flow in, and when indeed people then decided, the members of CATPC, that that money would not be used to buy motorcycles or flat screens or sneakers, but to buy back land. That's something that was entirely thought through and then also executed by members of CATPC, not only buying back the land, but then also how to use that land, and that it would become an alternative to the dominant monocultural plantations. And so the interaction between the land, so the means of production in that way, and the white cube, the means of production in that way, and the art that developed between those two entities, that is completely out of my hands. I seek no agency in it. So it's both very top-down and it's also completely horizontal. And these are complex negotiations indeed. And it's, I think, by embracing this complexity and not shying away from it, this indeed is just how it reflects in a way the state of the world and the power imbalances in the world. I have partially reproduced them to be able to use that agency in yet other ways than what is normally the case.
There were no objections to the initial top-down from the natives?
From the members of no. I mean, of course, I went through I asked permission to the government, and the Minister of Culture came to give it its blessing. He laid the first stone. The chiefs of the region, I had lengthy discussions with them. I explained them why I thought it was necessary. Of course, I paid the right taxes and this and that. And we discussed at length what the white cube could and should do, and there my agency stopped also. The project only became interesting when CATPC members decided what to do with it, and when they decided that it was a tomb to the sculptures that are not there anymore, and that they would put one of their sculptures in it, notably the art collector. And they built different other little museums, I should say, out of bamboo, in which they put many other sculptures at the opening ceremony about a year ago. And not only the chocolate sculptures, but also performances and sculptures more ephemeral, even if the chocolate ones are ephemeral too, but made out of wood and grass. And so I think it was some type of an act of institutional critique in a way, for me to repatriate that white cube. But then how it would be used and how it's going to be used in the future is largely out of my hands.
Charles, I'd like you to talk a little bit about some of the projects that you mentioned in your brief 15 minutes. Can you hear me? Also, the initial phases of negotiation, in particular, the piece where the Chinese, the copies were shown in the Chinese village. How did that come to be?
I mean, as I said, I don't think you have to enact transcultural artistic exchange. It comes
We're
to
just
you.
doing it.
So I mean, it's very simple in that sense. It came to us in the sense that, you know, part of our job is to go and meet people and to discuss things. And we'd already been interested in this question of what the legacy of modernism, which is locked up in, you know, to some extent, like the ethnographic museums, also the majority of the archives of modernism are also held in Western Europe. They haven't been shared, even though modernism has had huge impacts elsewhere. It's actually not been shared to the same extent. And so that question was one that we were playing around with. So I suppose because we were or the museum was starting to ask those questions, then Li Mu also came to us. So he found us as much as we found him. And then after that, it was a question of negotiating. So the original proposal would have been to actually ship the works to China. But we'd just done a similar project to that in Palestine. And so we said, well, you know, we don't want to become this institution that simply ships its work for a temporary period of time. There are problems around that. So what else can we do? And out of that discussion, we developed this idea of copying. And what was interesting with the copying meant that we had to then redocument a lot of that work because we didn't have, for instance, the sufficient resolution of the Mao images of Warhol, for instance. So we had to rephotograph them in order to produce them. We had to investigate the production of a Richard Long, for instance, or a Dutch artist, because we didn't know how it was produced to the degree that we needed to know in order to reproduce it, because that's not part of the task of preservation and conservation. It's not reproduction. So you look at the work entirely differently. So this idea of reproduction then prompted a whole series of new investigations of the works that we ourselves had, which was fascinating for us in a museological sense. Yeah. But also it meant that we now have different knowledge of those works, and also that those works, I think, have a different register. If you show those images of the Solowit, but there are also others that have been played with, it becomes, in a sense, it becomes a different kind of work. Yeah? It has a different... The idea of the museum as a mausoleum in which things come to die and are simply preserved, a sort of catacomb, if you like, that idea, I think, is defeated by a project like this. And it's only a marginal defeat, still dominantly catacombs and mausoleums. But nevertheless, there's a gesture here which says that Solowit's become alive again. And I think that's quite interesting because if you go back to the intentionality of Solowit, for instance, he was interested in the conceptual construction of that project rather than its materialization. So therefore its materialization seems perfectly legitimate to rematerialize it in those conditions.
This ties a little bit into Clémentine's manifesto, beautifully performed, thank you. This idea that objects are somewhere sequestered and maybe go to die. I would like to know how your new model could possibly come to pass. You made this very compelling argument.
I exist in a kind of bipolar curatorial situation in the sense that I ran a museum. I created a post-ethnographic model for this museum. I wrote a manifesto, the post-ethnographic manifesto, and I reprioritized space in the museum. I'm always fascinated by the Hemmungen, the handicaps that museum directors feel towards a reprioritization of space. What I needed was a form of laboratory, workshop, I've always grown up in workshops. I wanted a workshop. I wanted production inside the museum. And I invited writers, filmmakers, lawyers. I love working with lawyers, working in tandem with lawyers on situations that require remediation. And it worked very well. But behind the scenes, there was a reaction from the part of the custodians who had been there for 30 years and who adhered to a 1980s do-it-yourself model of the Ethnographic Museum, which has been superseded and that there's not much they can do about it. Yeah? But I was also subjected to a form of xenophobic, scientific xenophobia, if you like. I was the first person to take on a German ethnographic museum who hadn't studied in Göttingen, Marburg, Cologne, or Hamburg, or whatever, but in London and elsewhere. And I came from contemporary art. I have a deeply ambivalent relationship to anthropology, so I had no qualms about killing, if you like, killing the ethnographic. And it led to my being thrown out of the museum and me fighting a court case, which I won. And since then, the model, the system, the ergonomy of the museum is one of the things that I get asked to talk about again and again. And when you invited me to this event, you and Hildegund, and I was told that I had 15 minutes to present a model, I was going to talk about another project that I'm working on called Organs and Alliances, which began, and that's one of the members of Organs and Alliances, Philippe Marquert, who's here working with Tony Shaker, I believe. He walked in at the right moment. And this was to go to two art colleges, Cergy in the suburbs of Paris and also the HGB in Leipzig, and to ask students how they form alliances today. How do they know they can trust somebody, and how can they develop a form of what I have called since 2001 conceptual intimacy? How can they exchange ideas that are not yet fully formed, that are not for the public to gloat on, that are not part of a market consumption? How do they know that they can trust the other person? Because I'm more and more disprepared to accept that the Biennale structure is the only structure that intelligent curators can work within, or board museum directors. And I think it's a big problem if there are more and more art students, more and more curatorial students who are being taught academic curating, and who then aspire and will say to me, did you hear there's a new Biennale opening in the north of India, or another one over here? And I want to resist that. I want to believe that the parallel discussions that curators, mediators, in the case of the commanditaire, and artists may actually lead to the construction of a new type of condition or format or model. And so this is the one side that I work on, if you like, the organs, the idea of the organ and the alliance, mimicking, of course, the political word alliance and raising that question. And effectively what we're doing, and Philip can talk better about it than I, is that the students then turn around and say, okay, you know what? We buy our own machine. We buy our means of production. And in this case, we buy a colonial printing press, and we shift it across the richest part of Europe, and we stop in locations. And the context in which we stop, and the means of production, and the infrastructure dictates the content. So it's not about having to say we have to write manifestos about climate change or migration policies. No, no, no. It's whatever is in the condition in which we stop that will dictate the content of what we print. So that's, if you like, one model that is I couldn't talk about in 15 minutes without doing injustice to the people I'm working with. And the other model is obviously a model that is, I wouldn't like to call it idealist, it's a reality. There are 6 million objects in ethnographic collections in Germany. There's maybe not 6 million in Austria. They weren't quite as good at collecting as the Germans. The French have sorted it out in their way with the Universal Museum. The Brits have done it in their way. Let's not even begin to talk about the Met and the Smithsonian and all the rest. But for me, there is some kind of sense of incredulity that this material, which constitutes, for want of a better term, the worlds in the plural, arts in the plural, histories in the plural, yeah, can continue to be ignored pretty much because the name of the person who made this work was consciously omitted from the documents during collecting expeditions. And it's only that enables the monocultural condition, the intellectual plantation of the discipline of anthropology to continue to claim a right of sole interpretation on this material. And I am concerned about the students who study curating, post-colonial studies, black studies, transcultural academies, God knows, all those permutations of earlier humanities. I'm concerned about where they can work, where they can produce new meanings. And where they would, for me, that's the idea, the model of the museum university is to say, museums are now kind of orgasmatrons of consumerism, right? They're not interesting, sorry, I mean, with, of course, a few exceptions. They look the same everywhere, wherever you go. The question of a university has now become inaccessible for so many people who are moving across the world, who cannot, professors who come from Syria cannot teach at the Goethe Institute, students or their children cannot go to the university. So it seems to me like a public space, a phenomenally important public space of democratic interaction and negotiation is the museum. And regardless of whether you pay now an entrance price or not, which is usually an SPD, CSU kind of fight, the potential of thinking a new architectonic for studying and working in many different ways inside of a space like a museum university on the basis of a collection is a challenge. And it's not just an intellectual challenge, it's an architectural challenge. Yeah?
I just wanted, one of my questions that I prepared long in advance is, what is the time frame for negotiations? And you're touching on this already. This is, I think a lot of young art practitioners today want to make change very quickly. It reflects the pace of life that we live in. I was looking at the timeframes of some of Alexander's, new patrons' work, but I don't think some of the changes you're proposing, Clémentine, I don't even know how they could be possible within our generation, or would they be? You can argue against me.
No, sorry, I don't want to, I mean, the interesting thing is, does it take a nouveau commanditaire? Does it take a patron in a new kind of structure to say, okay, let's get the people we know who have collections of so-called tribal art. See, this is also the problem, is that the tribal art market focuses on a taste and a genre that comes out of the 19th century. The moment you open the stores, there's a whole load of other stuff that comes out that isn't being digitized, that isn't qualified already. So the question is, if we wait for the Humboldt Forum, we wait till the Saint-Glinglin, as they say in French, right? It's never going to happen. They're not interested because they are coming, provenance. Provenance has come like from the heavens. And all of a sudden, the anthropologists who were 60, 65, who were going to leave their positions as custodians of these objects, are back in there. And they're able to turn the younger generation into saying, do an object biography. And then they go and they look and they don't find anything because nothing was collected. You can't ask someone exactly who made an object on the banks of Papua New Guinea, on the banks of the Sepik River, when in 1963 you bring back 4,500 objects to Frankfurt with taxpayers' money. You don't have time to say, what is the name of this work? Who made this work? How long have you had it? Do you mind if I photograph you with it? No, because then immediately the person is going to say, hold on a minute, maybe I'm not going to let you take it, right? So it's all done back at base, and that's when the magnanimity of the state, the magnanimity of anthropology comes into gear. And this is what's happening again. Yes, we need provenance studies, but as a lawyer who I'm working with in Paris is suggesting, let's use the traction of restitution, use the traction of provenance study to just at least open up a space where there could be a reinterpretation or a polymathic, a generalist, if you like, Charles, a generalist understanding of what this material is.
Alexander, you've been quiet. I haven't asked you a direct question yet. Here we go. What What are we negotiating for? What are we aiming for through our transcultural artistic exchange, which we can interpret as we will?
I mean, I was just thinking that what we all have in common is that we're trying to practice something or to introduce or induce something that meets a lot of resistance. Mm-hmm. I think each of us. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So one negotiation that goes on for all of us, and maybe for many in the room here also, is to really go against the stubbornness that's there. Mm-hmm. Go against the bureaucracy that's there. Go against the common sense that's there. So I spent a lot of years in Germany talking about the new patrons, trying to find allies, etc. And I constantly hear, oh, we have that already. Mm-hmm. We have so much participatory art. And I'm like, this is not participatory art. Has nothing to do. It's something very different when citizens take ownership over the process of commissioning work of art. I mean, of course, you can say there goes participation on, yeah? But what people didn't understand at that time was that most participatory structures we deal with are top-down built containers in which people are invited to behave in predetermined ways, yeah? And one thing that is very crucial in the new patrons, and I think it's quite rare, is there is never an artist decided unless it has become totally clear for the commissioning community what type of artist they really want, because they understand what type of project they actually want to do. All this needs time, and I'm talking now like on the broader level of installing such activities as we all do, and that's one temporality. What Clémentine is like fighting for, as I said like a few minutes ago, it's a historical project. Like new patrons always, also. I can imagine a world where we will have at some point 50 mediators in Germany and a pan-African network of mediators and all these people like meeting in different ways, exchanging their experiences. You can do that tomorrow if there's enough political will and enough resources to do that. And it would be, I see it as a paradigm shift in the way how art comes into the societies.
It would be great, no, if Documenta would be everywhere next time.
Why not?
For example.
Yeah.
Like, why not let the next Documenta be commissioned by the people?
And
there's, I said this is methodology. Actually, there's now a program in France where scientific studies are commissioned. So it's the first step outside of art, because of course you can. It's such an easy general methodology that basically it could play out in any given situation. Or for the Kunstvereine in Germany, it's a nice model to also open up the institution and say, at least for practical reasons, one exhibition each year will be commissioned by citizens from the city, yeah, so that the institution can behave and respond in a responsible way and bringing their competences to issues that are actually urgent for people. And I think it could recreate bounds between those different actors. And one thing that really sucks in the contemporary art world is the arrogance of the experts, including curators, to believe that we really know what goes on, mm-hmm. and what needs to be done, and what needs to be debated, and what needs to be produced. This is an extremely stubborn, mostly academic position to have. And what it does create since a very long time is a culture and an economy of the offer. Like, it's a totally capitalist blueprint. We create products that we offer, and then we hope that the general population will have enough of a demand to buy it in forms of museum tickets, catalogs, or whatsoever. Yeah?
And that's also why we hold on to things and don't let them get restituted quickly. I mean, you have to, I've asked myself, why do people want to hold on to this stuff? Most of it is insured for a pittance, these ethnographic objects. What is their problem? It was a kleptomania, serial. Why don't they send it back? And if it goes back onto the market, so it goes back onto the market, and then there is a circulation, and then one can evaluate again. You can't evaluate something that is stagnant. Not in any form or not even love, yeah? Can you evaluate all alone? So there's something bizarre about this projection of a reservoir of energy, like your reservoirs of the plant. That's why when I came to the Congo and I saw what you were doing, I was really impressed because, if you don't mind me just adding to what you described, the presentation of the OMA white cube, it was engineered by the farmers, by the CATPC, and the first day was a day purely about agriculture, where they let a chocolate head melt in the burning sun, talked about polyculture, and the next day was the opening of the white cube. But the interesting thing was that it was the chocolate collector who was sitting alone in the white cube, and outside the Marlène Dumas, the Kaderatia, the and the Taimans, they were introduced into the most bizarre labyrinth made out of bamboos, and they had decided that they were going to work on this like that. Yeah? So there was a very clear, intentional structure that could not be removed. Mathieu's work could not be removed and recreated easily. It would dry up, yeah? It would break. It was everything that can't be transported, whereas the chocolate chappie from Belgium, like he should be, or from Holland, wherever he was from, was sitting in the white cube at that point without a roof. It was brilliant. Yeah?
So I think what you're pointing at is something that we should consider more. Like in this case, people are taking over the situation. What I'm talking about is a culture of demand, where people like can not participate, but say, this is something that we need, and we ask you also, guys, to take responsibility over that. You know, like, we are concerned. We have urgencies, for example, populism. You guys come from the art world. You may understand something that can be done in order to respond to that. Like, we as citizens maybe for now don't. Like, we need you here. And so to create spaces, I think it's connected to the general idea of transculturalism, to imagine even, and it's like institutionally very difficult, I think, even to do that there can be spaces where these things can happen out of their own dynamics, out of their own demands, would bring us in completely different situation of responsibility, including very different situations and urgencies of artistic production.
Yeah, I mean, I'm covered because I wasn't, but I will bring it back once more. I mean, Clémentine just said once more to the author. Because for me, ambiguity is also important. Yes, we have responsibilities. Yes, we can change things in Congo, here, there, repatriation, do this, but still, we have to have the benefit of the doubt. Yes, we are responsible, but I don't think that art is here to change the world's problems. They shouldn't even think from the canon and the agency of art that we are capable of doing this.
I didn't say that.
Yeah, I'm just saying, because we were saying, of course you don't say, I take it to the extent. I'm just saying that this kind of responsibility that we'll feel, I find a kind of a problematic relationship on citizens going to the arts to ask the artist to help them to somehow change the situation on one way or another. I mean, we know many practices that they are doing that, and I still am dubious about some of these practices. What I found very interesting, though, it's the copies that you were saying, because I think that, yes, the author and the museum and how the reservoirs and all this is a solution. I'm not sure even if all these objects need a name who made them, because this is a modern idea of art. Maybe some of the people that made these objects, they don't even want them to be.
Hold on,
Yeah.
Hold on. We're in a world of copyright. Inside these collections, which covered everything that the other did, how it slept the other, how the other made love, how they fed, how they had, what kinds of architecture, what kinds of irrigation systems, what kind of traps they laid to catch fish. These are things that have deep technicity and ingenuity. They have no copyright. Now, when you have a collection of the world's art histories that cannot be recreated, can't be copied, cannot be copied in that way. It's not about copying. It's about providing access so that engineers, people from all over the world, including the source community, obviously, can look at these things and extract from these massive collections the things that are relevant today, not the things that are fetishes of the 19th century, and from these objects create new works.
Exactly.
Could be a filter for a car, could be a form of architectural roofing derived from a fish trap. And at that point, if there is proof of technicity, it can be patented. And so in many different ways, you can, if you like, restore the absent, undocumented name to this enormous amount of work.
Yeah, because I guess there are communities that they don't want their object to be exhibited in a museum, or they want their object to be destroyed. There are communities, there are objects looted by communities that they wanted. I mean, we know many communities as such, in indigenous Brazilian communities, that they have in their religion their objects to be destroyed. So they're very, very, very disturbed about objects being kept in any kind of reservoirs.
Sure, but
Yeah,
the question
so that's
is...
why I wanted just to stress that for me it's kind of important, the restitution, more even so than the...
But restitution can take hundreds of years. It's piecemeal. Macron is working with Zinzu in Benin because it's an industrial...
That's why the copies was a very
La Drette
good...
de la Charrière. At the same time that Macron is proposing to send back maybe 2 or 3 Benin bronzes, La Drette de la Charrière gives 38 works to the Musée du Quai Branly with an estimated evaluation of 52 million, and tries to get in the clause, and I know because I'm on the scientific council, tries to get in a clause where he stops the restitution of these objects back to Africa.
Yeah, that's...
So this is all about another structure of dialogue that's going on. And all I'm suggesting is that if there isn't some attempt to occupy these collections on the part of the younger generation, because actually it doesn't work for us guys up here to talk constantly about avant-garde models. We're talking about models that come out of an avant-garde.
Copies is not an avant-garde.
I'm seeing a sign with the number 3.
Yeah.
Okay.
Totally.
And questions from the audience. We have to allow the audience to participate. I'm sorry, you guys. Charles, can you say something in 30 seconds? No, I'm
It's
kidding.
to slightly take it away, and maybe I'll be quick, but I was interested when Clémentine talked about working with lawyers, because I think in my experience, the resistance that comes, certainly internally, is often legal and juridical. It's about, and in a sense, those are the changes, because people feel a legal responsibility, which is a different kind of responsibility, the responsibility we've been talking about up to now. A legal responsibility to acquit their roles in a way which is legitimated by a legal system. So therefore, in museums, legally are required to keep the works in perpetuity. I mean, it's incredibly hubristic idea that eternity exists. But essentially, that's written into the codes of museums. So often, the biggest resistance is, the museum is very happy to have a new avant-garde within the legal structures which are already determined, which is, of course, nothing to do with any kind of revolutionary change. It's simply providing the next generation to reproduce the provocation or the shock or whatever that previous generations have done. And in that sense, the avant-garde is completely useless because it doesn't tackle that idea of the legal and the juridical changes. And I think that's, in a sense, if we're thinking about where young people, if you like, could be working, or where change actually might be effective at that paradigm shift level, to me, it's really, in our world, in museums and other structures, maybe even biennales, legal and juridical setup, they're structuring. That's what I find interesting about Renzo's work, amongst other things, is the fact that he's thinking about the structures in which this circulation happens, rather than simply accepting them and trying to produce some decorative object that would fit nicely within them. And I think the majority of artists, honestly, are working within that structure and decorating it.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to open this up to the audience. We have just a few minutes. Tony? I think we have a microphone now. It's coming at you.
Hi.
Hi.
Is this working? Thank you. Thank you for the contributions, for the exciting talk. But everybody was talking about Western Europe and the West. And I was wondering if, you seem to be in agreement, and I was wondering if you could explain to people who are not from Europe, not from that West, what do you mean exactly? Because for somebody coming from my place, speaking from my place, from the Eastern Mediterranean, I don't see this homogeneous Western Europe that you speak of. I see something else. So maybe this should be explained. And with that, also a question for Marina, because you also spoke about yourself as coming from, as being a Western curator, and you are Greek, correct? You are from
no,
Greece.
I didn't understand. I spoke about the South as?
You spoke of yourself as being a Western curator.
Yeah.
And since you are from Greece, I was a bit perplexed.
Okay.
Because, Greece is,
Yeah.
when did it start being in Europe,
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Should I start?
Yes.
And another footnote to this question of the West is, especially in Charles's presentation, is that colonialism is not a Western thing. China colonized Korea long before there was Western colonialism. The Iranian Empire colonized India, and there's abstractions you can make out of these pre-European types of colonialism that matches European colonialism. I think part of not looking in that mirror is to stop thinking colonialism is just a European thing and began in like 1492. Colonialism did not begin in 1492, I'm sorry. So, and also it would be good to extend this to like talk about all these things because again, it goes back to the question of what is West, you know what I mean? Like the presence of Syrian army in Lebanon was colonialism. I mean, there's so much to it, so.
And East and West Germany badly need a post-colonial discourse as well.
I mean, I can answer that maybe quickly, because I didn't say colonialism began in 1492 as such. I talked about modernity, and I think we could make a distinction.
Because modernity for us in Iran began when intelligentsia started to push back against the Islamic culture that came, and particularly the type of literary humanism that came out of Iran was inspiring to Western modernism. Who says modernism is Western thing? It's not. Neither modernity nor colonialism can be copyrighted by Western people. Even if it's...
I just
had to put that, I don't want to discuss this later. Sure.
Marina, did you?
Yeah.
You can jump in at this point.
First of all, I have to remember why I called myself a Western curator. It was a diminutive, first of all. Second, unfortunately or fortunately, the Enlightenment decided for Greece that we are the cradle of Western civilization, which we are not. That's a cultural appropriation, let's put it that way, and on the other hand, claiming even the South as a state of mind it's not exactly a territorial claim. I never called myself before, because I really, truly believe to something that here we have been criminalized, the global, the global vision or the globality or the planetary. I truly believe in a kind of a methexis, in a kind of interaction, and also in a kind of hybridity in the sense Michel Serres, in a kind of transgression, in the way Michel Serres explains it. We are sort of open to mutual So I find this kind of new fragmentation or new need for fragmentation very also problematic at the same time. You know, this kind of sovereignties that all of a sudden cannot be in relation. I think actually is what gives lead to the new fascistic movements, because, you know, you can go all the ways. So the reason why I called myself Western, because I didn't want to accuse the Western curators and put myself out of it as a good Greek, you know, or the good Eastern, or the good South. The way why we call the Martens South as a state of mind is not because we wanted to say, hey, we are from the South and not from the... It's because we wanted to put forward that South is, or any kind of geographical characterization is being used as a diminutive, is being used like a different, an alternative way of thinking about the world than the Western way, as, you know, the West believes. And West is not only Europe, right? It's other places as well, the Western thinking. And any alternative way would be bad. So you know. So that's what we wanted to open up, let's say, for an unexpected dialogue and maybe new commons based on the idea of luck. Based, luck, not luck with you, maybe luck with you, but also luck with aid, you know, luck over the, you know, new needs, or maybe commons based to resonance and empathy, as opposed to, you know, neighborhoods or neighboring or geographical. I don't really believe, as you were saying before, or who was saying, I think you were saying about the cartography and how these kind of borders are being drawn. I mean, my grandfather been through the Treaty of Lausanne, which is something very similar to the Convention of London, and all these people that decide what east, what west after the Ottoman Empire, it's not people that are trustworthy. I mean, it was not a process that is trustworthy to me. It was a negotiation, a kind of an economical negotiation. So, on that base, I used the geographical more metaphorically. I truly believe that any pole, apart from that of death and life, the two opposite poles, let's say, are also en meaning like in transition. Everything change. I really believe it's a metaphor, it's a transit. South is a transit. North is, of course, there are post-colonial histories, and I would call actually post-colonial and not even decolonial, because I really also believe that the colonization process never stopped. So maybe we are under crypto-colonial phase. But I wouldn't speak about decolonialization or post-colonialization or If we have to decolonize, something is ourselves more than anything else. Each one decolonize ourselves, and then we see what we do with the crypto-colonization.
I mean, maybe it's a really long discussion, and I wouldn't want to deny any notion of origin outside of Europe. Absolutely not. Nor to try and trace the particularities of colonialism in different parts of the world. I completely accept what you say. I do think that there are certain economic structures associated with transatlantic slavery, which has its origins in the Atlantic trade and the Triangle, which we need to see as particular. So they're particular within histories of coloniality, and those particularities produced something like the Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven. So there's a direct link between the coloniality of the Netherlands as a specific place and the existence of the institution that I have responsibility for. And I think without understanding those links, by generalizing colonialism, for instance, without specifying those links, I would feel much less happy about the discussions that I have within the museum, to understand that those specific links which are connected to, and I think Western Europe is a fiction. Yeah, Western Europe exists in the mirror. It doesn't exist in any objective level. That's why this mirror analogy of Galliano is so important. I think it's so useful because it presents it as a subjective experience, not an objective content. So when we talk about what is Western Europe is in the mirror. It's nowhere else. It doesn't exist the other side of the mirror. It exists only in the mirror. And I think that when we understand that, then maybe also combined with specificity, we can talk about these relationships without excluding. And wouldn't want to get, there's a great video by Rabia Moret, another Beirut artist, where he says, it's about the cycle of remembering and forgetting. And he said in going through this cycle, we don't have to think about origins and we have beginnings anyway. And I don't think that I want to get into a discussion of origins. I totally accept that there's a plurality of origins of these things, and it was perfectly possible that a Chinese or an Iranian or a Persian empire could have discovered the capitalist seed, if you like, which generated the transatlantic slave trade and generated the system. But they didn't. And so we are faced in Western Europe with our particular history and trying to deal with that.
Actually, the Ottoman Empire promoted multiplicity.
And also the Ottoman Empire, by not becoming a trading capitalist empire, failed in a sense. It wasn't able to, it didn't have that gene within it, in a certain sense.
We've got about, I'm seeing it two more questions. Okay, I think we've been given permission to go a little bit longer because this is interesting. First question from the back.
Hi, thank you all for your very interesting presentations, and I think I'm going to take the conversation a little in the direction that it's already moving, which is to say that perhaps if, as Charles said, we were to see colonialism in terms of reflection and reciprocity, then there might be more interesting kind of turbulences that get produced. For instance, if we look at the development of factory systems in Europe, in Western Europe specifically, it happens in 3 waves. The second wave is the one that we know very well, which is the post-Ford, the assembly line. There is one that also gets produced through the disciplines of the First World War, but it's the first wave that actually doesn't get understood that well. The organization of laboring bodies in factories in Western Europe, particularly in places like the Netherlands, Belgium, France, and England, is a direct translation of the plantation system. So in a sense, it was industrial capitalism at its origins learning from the plantation, from the experience that it acquired elsewhere. And if you look at property rights, land tenure, it's very similar. There is no private property in land in Ireland prior to the production of private property in land in Bengal by the East India Company. They transplant the same legal procedures to Ireland that they used in Bengal. And this produces all sorts of strange currents. Currently, I'm working a lot on the First World War and Indian soldiers. There are more Indian and African bodies in Europe between 1914 and 18 than there are refugees now. And they're obviously in high demand because the tide of the Great War is turned on the basis of the presence of these bodies. But what's very interesting is that they, by and large, the Indian and African soldiers and some Vietnamese soldiers are healthier, stronger, and better fed than their European counterparts. And they all remark on this in their diaries, because the vast majorities of the European armies in the First World War are conscripts. They are the very poor, whereas the vast majorities of the armies from the colonies are volunteers who've been trained and fed to fight. So when they come to Europe, they often see Europe as a space of extreme poverty. They have these extraordinary episodes of sympathy for the poor European and produce a kind of reverse, a kind of Occidentalism, which often gets translated back into what they carry home with them. So what I'm saying is that perhaps one way of dealing with this question is to admit that it's not going to get better. You cannot make the experience of colonialism, any part of the world, feel better by restituting objects. Because whatever it was, was. It might in fact be even more interesting if European museums decided or raised the question of what part of the European cultural heritage they would like to see taken away from them and sent to other lands. Because that would be recompense of a sort. You can recompense the feeling of loss only with a feeling of loss. So if Picassos and Rembrandts and Braques were suddenly to travel to places where there are very poor insurance conditions, where museums are not in good order, and where things will go wrong and these artifacts will be distressed and destroyed, that might be interesting.
Maybe I can respond to Tony here with the latter part, not the factory workers, but this latter part that you mentioned. In the first time I ever gave this, I've only declared this manifesto. I think you don't give one, you declare it twice. Today, and the first time was in Dakar at the conference that was set up during the Dakar Biennale in May. And the next day I went into the new museum that was built, that was Senghor's wish to build a Musée des Civilisations Noires. And Wade, who was a big money launderer, he built it with money and support from the People's Republic of China. This is nothing new in Africa. We know that they built the railroads, they built the stadia in the 1980s, and now they built this museum. And it's extraordinary because inside, all the signage is in Mandarin. Yeah, it's not like it's in French or Wolof or even English. It's in Mandarin. And secondly, the director is waiting for holograms to arrive. Yeah? Now, whilst this is going on, there's the Biennale, and it's running and people are upset, it's not right, and there's a young curator who didn't get his act together and another one isn't happy, and the artists aren't happy and they don't know if their work will be properly installed. And all the time, there is this unspoken question of the 20th century, of paintings. Not just Senghor and his knighthoods of painters, but the whole phenomenon of painting and sculpture in 20th century Africa, including not only the Congo, but in particular in this case in Senegal. There is no patronage for storage. Termites are eating the paintings, Meanwhile, people are talking about restituting works to Senegal, which oddly enough is, if you go to ethnographic museums, it's the one part of the world where you won't find objects other than gold or basketry, because in great part the aesthetics is in the voice. So you will find the heads of UNICEF, the heads of Amnesty International, etc., who are Senegalese. So the question for me is, can we use the argument of restitution not as some kind of fairy story that you feed back to people who haven't got their objects, but as traction, as the only legal traction that might be possible in order to introduce other aspects that need to be looked at today. For example, rights of access. So the argument goes that during the time it will take to get anything going in restitution, somebody has to open these doors. Somebody has to let us in to look at these objects. It's not possible. You can't just incarcerate all this material, put the lid on it, and kind of think that that's okay, that you don't need it anymore. You have the right to look at it. You have the right to consider it. And then you also have the question of what to do about these paintings which are regarded as copies. You see, I don't buy the thing with the solar wit. I think that works because it's abstract. And I think that there is another subtending problem of derivation or Vorstellungen, of presuppositions of derivation, which are located in things that are paintings, for example. Even though we know, not only 150,000 years ago with caves, but that in Namibia they found portable paintings that are 20,000 years old, right? So I take your point, Tony, but actually I think that there is a discussion that has to be looked at, which can't get stuck in the academic corridors of a decoloniality, and has to sort of be like, okay, the collections, conservation is the biggest impenetrable ideology that we have, and that is part of the legal system. Who says you cannot put a hat on your head because the oils of your skin will affect the longevity of this hat, when in a case like the small museum that I ran with 70,000 objects, well, we had 50 bridal hats from Papua New Guinea. I mean, what's going on here, right? So there is a closure, an incarceration procedure that requires legal leverage, requires a kind of an attempt at least to say to the Humboldt Forum, guys, you have to do something. Now the question is, who says that? Some bonkers, bipolar academic like me? Or what is the condition, right? Is it going to be a bunch of museum directors from Africa and elsewhere who go to very boring conferences, that are set up by ICOM or UNESCO, Is it this terrible form of diplomatic discussion that leads nowhere, and then eventually one object is returned? So I think that the unfolding of this question of restitution is vital if we are going to present any other models in 2018. 2018. We're already midway nearly into the 21st century, and this stuff is lying there and you don't care. One doesn't care because it's not the issue.
But who do you propose should look at it first?
I think it should be open access. It should be open access, open source, and not only through the digital. Mm-hmm. It's impossible to claim that a photograph of a glasses case taken for digital purposes is sufficient other than as a representation on a screen. right? So there is so much that goes into this representation through digital, let alone the fact that the stuff that gets selected is not what artist and engineer and architect might pull out of the shelf. And I had that experience. It was nearly 99% of the time, it wasn't the objects that the custodians knew anything about. And the custodians, they're not a dying breed. They propagate themselves through books. They're armchair anthropologists of the most self-sufficient variety.
Sorry.
One more question.
Okay.
Yeah, super, thank you.
There is far too many interesting things that I would like to address, but I cannot and I will not. But first to say, I very much agree with the idea that what's past is past and one needs to move on. There was an example that I think might be interesting, and I might base some question on it. There is an example called Majority World, which comes from Bangladesh, and it's a photographic agency that readdresses the issue of where the initiative comes from, not just from Europe, but as an actually direct initiative on very on not even equal footing, but even maybe higher footing, that brings back to Europe idea that we need to learn from somebody else, not just from us. And it addresses a linguistic issue, which is called majority world. Then we don't belong to South and North, which is again binary concept that is conflicting. But we can acknowledge that we live in a majority world if we think and feel so. It was founded by Shahidul Alam, who was arrested regarding those claims for the protests that happened in Bangladesh. But in all that, I wanted to build on this example and say, okay, we have ethnographic collections. Whether we give something back or not, it's irrelevant, but how much we can use them to bring the universities in which somebody from Bangladesh, somebody from Syria, somebody from somewhere else will teach in Germany, in wherever, Europe. And because it's very hard to get a visa for those people nowadays. So how the institution can address getting those people to teach based on those things. And the same thing with Renzo's, if I may ask, is a great idea of these chocolate sculptures, but where were the teachers? They stayed in Congo. And for me, the way to make the world go round is really to make the world go round, not just to have this west-east, west-south, whatever, north-south, but to make it go round. So why not to turn Berlin to Baghdad railway back with the knowledge and with the initiatives like you have? So how can we do that? How can we bring ethnographic collections to be the foundation of universities that other people, and how we can bring the teachers that make those chocolate statues to teach us?
The people who made the sculptures, as you pointed out, it's very hard to get visa. We recently, maybe 3 months ago, did an attempt to get a visa for one of them, for Cédric Damascene, and he didn't get it, he couldn't come. 1 year before that, when there was a show in New York, one other member of CATPC, Mathieu Kassiyama, got a visa, so he went to New York and was then on the front page of the art section of the New York Times. So it works somewhat, yeah. But you could say that it's, I'm not sure if it's as important as you suggest. Even the very exhibition in New York, maybe in the end, it's similar to the dominant model that I try to critique a little bit. That is that, in a way, a group of plantation workers from Congo making a great show in New York contributes mostly to the intellectual climate, the artistic climate, and then also financial interests in New York. So it's more interesting, that was kind of the trigger, it's more interesting to to bring the apparatus that can trigger such financial and economic interests on the plantation itself. That is more interesting. So, of course, it was great for Mathieu to go to New York, and he went to the Met, he saw ethnographic pieces from his people that he was indeed not allowed to touch. And when he did it anyways, there's going to be a film in a half year in which you will see that he touches it anyway, and everybody gets mad. But anyway, it was more important to bring, let's say, the tools, the means of production of artistic attention and the entire economic apparatus that revolves around it, to bring back that to the plantation. Yeah, as another step in certainly what is a longer trajectory. Yeah.
It's just a brief point to respond also to Shuda, and I think I'm certainly very interested in this idea of the archive of modernism, which is the short modern period from, say, the mid-19th century until 1968 or so. That period, certainly in a country like the Netherlands, particularly the latter period of that, is obsessively archived within the Netherlands itself and retained. And you talk about 50 bridal hats, but there's 50 soloists. In each museum almost. So, the possibility of redistributing that as in relationship to questions of restitution, I think are extremely interesting. And we've even had some discussions with some people in Indonesia, which is a longer story, but basically they don't want the objects back because they have no particular resonance, but they want something back. And so then you have another discussion, which is not about the restoration of these objects which have lost any kind of spiritual charge which they might have once had, are effectively dead and lost. But they say, but yes, but you took something, so what do you give us back? What's the exchange? What's the potlatch? What's the possibility of trade in this relationship?
I love the idea of sending the Rembrandts to museums that don't have air conditioning. I really think that's...
And I think that's something that within this discussion of, as a subtext, I'm not saying that it's the whole discussion, but within the discussion about restitution, I find that a fascinating line to take, and I hope it's something that I can also push forward to a certain degree with the collection that we have.
It's time to break. If everyone could be back here for the next section at 17:15, and you will be available, the panelists are around for any further discussions or questions, just on an informal level. Thank you.